Okay, so let me start with something that I think a lot of people felt the moment this story broke. There is something deeply ironic, almost poetic in the worst possible way, about a couple who have built their entire post-royal identity around controlling their own narrative, accidentally making someone else's narrative stronger. And that is exactly what I think happened here. Harry and Meghan responded to Tom Bower's book, Betrayal. And in doing so, they may have handed Tom Bower the biggest gift he could have possibly asked for. Let me take you through this properly because there is so much to unpack and I want to make sure we do justice to every layer of it. This is not a simple story. This is not just they responded to a book and it went badly. This is a story about strategy, about psychology, about the very specific trap that comes with being a public figure who cares, perhaps too much, about what the world thinks of them. So let's go back to the beginning. Tom Bower is not a new name in this conversation. He has written critically about powerful figures for decades. His book on Meghan Revenge came out a few years ago and caused significant waves. Now he has Betrayal, and the claims in this book, from what has been reported and discussed publicly, are ones that clearly got under the skin of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex in a very significant way. Significant enough that they felt they could not stay silent. Significant enough that they put out a statement. And that decision, that choice to respond, is where I think the whole thing started to unravel for them. Here is the fundamental rule of PR that every communications professional will tell you that every media trainer hammers into their clients from day one. When someone makes a claim about you, especially a claim in a book, especially a claim from a journalist with a track record, your response is not neutral. Your response is itself a piece of news, and the nature of your response tells the audience something, whether you intend it to or not. A calm, measured, brief dismissal says one thing. A lengthy, emotionally charged statement says something else entirely. And what Harry and Meghan put out was not calm. It was not brief. It was emotional. It was intense. And the internet noticed, immediately. Now I want to be fair here because I think it's important. I genuinely believe that Harry and Meghan are human beings who feel things deeply. I think the frustration of constantly being written about, constantly having your motivations questioned, constantly seeing your story told by people who you feel do not know you or do not like you, that must be exhausting in a way that most of us cannot fully imagine. And when you are exhausted and you are hurt and you see something that feels deeply unfair, the instinct is to fight back. That instinct is human. That instinct makes complete sense. But here is where being a public figure at their level diverges from being a regular person. Regular people can fire back at critics. Regular people can post something emotional and have it forgotten in 24 hours. Harry and Meghan do not have that luxury. Every single word they put into the public domain is analyzed, archived, compared against previous statements, and used to construct a narrative about who they are. They know this. They have lived this for years, which is why the decision to respond the way they did is so puzzling to so many observers. Let's talk about what their statement actually did. Beyond the specific words, and I'm not going to quote it extensively because the point is the meta-level effect, what their statement did was confirm that Tom Bower's book mattered to them enormously, and in the world of public perception, attention equals credibility. When you are a figure of the global stature of Harry and Meghan and you personally respond to a book, you are essentially telling the entire world, this book is important enough for us to address. This book got to us. This book is something you should know about if you don't already. Before their statement, plenty of people had no idea Betrayal existed or had not paid much attention to it. After their statement, it was everywhere. Sales almost certainly spiked. Media coverage exploded. Suddenly, journalists who had barely glanced at the book were reading it closely, looking for the specific claims that had provoked such a strong reaction. The Streisand effect, that famous phenomenon where trying to suppress or discredit information ends up amplifying it massively, played out in real time. And it was painful to watch if you were watching from the perspective of someone trying to understand their strategy. But here is where it gets even more complicated. Because it is not just that they drew attention to the book, it is the specific way they chose to fight back that raised so many eyebrows. They went after Tom Bower personally and professionally. They questioned his credibility, his methods, his motivations. They were forceful, and they were pointed. And, immediately, and I mean immediately, the question that every journalist, every royal commentator, every person with even a passing interest in media law asked was the same question. If this is false, why not sue? That question sounds simple, but it is actually devastating in its implications. Because defamation law exists precisely for situations like this. If a journalist makes false claims about you in a published book that damages your reputation, you have legal recourse. Harry and Meghan are not people without resources. They are not people without legal teams. They have pursued legal action before, successfully in some cases. So the choice not to pursue legal action while simultaneously making very strong public statements about the inaccuracy of the claims, that gap between the rhetoric and the legal action is something that a lot of people found very hard to ignore. Now, to be fair, and again I want to be balanced here, there are legitimate reasons why public figures choose not to sue even when they believe claims are false. Litigation is slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Discovery, the legal process, where both sides have to hand over evidence and can surface things you would rather keep private. A courtroom is not a controlled environment in the way a carefully crafted public statement is. And sometimes the calculation is that fighting in court creates more coverage, more damage, more oxygen for the story than simply pushing back publicly and moving on. These are real considerations. But here's the problem. When you make the choice not to sue and instead make aggressive public statements, you leave a void. And in that void, people draw their own conclusions. And the conclusion that a significant portion of the public drew was not favorable to Harry and Meghan. The optics of "we are furious about these claims and they are completely false, but we will not be pursuing legal action," simply do not land. Well, when you are already operating in a trust deficit with a significant portion of your audience, and that trust deficit is something we need to talk about because it is central to understanding why this particular moment landed so badly. Harry and Meghan have, over the last several years, made a series of choices that have chipped away at the goodwill they once had, even among people who were initially very sympathetic to their situation. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the memoir Spare, each of these was positioned as them telling their truth. And there is validity in that framing. They have been treated badly in certain ways. Some of the press coverage they received was genuinely appalling. Some of the racial undertones in how Meghan in particular was covered were real and documented. But here is what happened over time. Each tell-all, each revelation, each dramatic claim created an expectation that the next one would be even bigger, even more dramatic. And with each escalation, the bar for what counted as credible got higher. And with Spare specifically, a book that made some claims that were later disputed or that people found difficult to reconcile with other known facts, the armor started to show some cracks. Not for their most devoted supporters who remained loyal regardless, but for the broader audience, the middle ground of people who were watching with an open mind. The accumulated weight of contradictions started to matter. So when Tom Bower's book comes out and Harry and Meghan respond with fury and intensity, that middle ground audience does not automatically side with them the way they might have done 3 or 4 years ago. Instead, many people in that middle ground are asking a different question. They are not asking, "Is Tom Bower telling the truth?" They are asking, "Why does this response feel so familiar?" Because it feels like a pattern. Strong denial, no legal action, heavy emotional language, accusations of bad faith journalism. It is a pattern they have seen before, and it no longer carries the automatic credibility it once might have. There is also something specifically interesting about the Tom Bower situation that I think makes it different from some of the other critics Harry and Meghan have pushed back against. Bower is not a tabloid. He's not a gossip columnist operating on anonymous tips. He is a serious biographer with decades of experience writing about powerful people. His methodology, extensive interviews, documentary research, cross-referencing, sources, is not perfect. No journalist's methodology is, but it has withstood scrutiny before. When you come at someone like that with an emotional public attack rather than a legal challenge, You are fighting on terrain that is not favorable to you. You are in a battle of credibility with someone whose professional credibility is quite robust. And this brings me to the point that I think is the most uncomfortable one for Harry and Meghan, but also the most important one to honestly examine. Their response in trying to discredit Tom Bower actually reinforced one of the central themes that critics have long associated with their public persona, the theme of cherry-picking. The idea that they are very selective about which narratives they challenge and which ones they let slide, based not on a consistent principle of journalistic accuracy, but on whether the narrative helps or hurts them, personally. Think about it this way. There is a lot written about Harry and Meghan. Some of it is positive, some of it is negative, some of it is probably accurate, some of it is probably not. But the pattern of which things they push back on and which things they allow to stand does seem to follow a consistent logic. Not the logic of, is this true? But the logic of, does this serve our narrative? The positive stories, the glowing profiles, the sympathetic coverage and that gets amplified, shared, used. The negative stories that feel uncomfortable or that hit close to home in some way, those get the statements, the denials, the legal threats. Now, every public figure does some version of this. I want to be honest about that. Nobody actively promotes stories that make them look bad. But the degree to which Harry and Meghan have built a public identity around the concept of honesty and authenticity and challenging the media establishment makes the cherry-picking particularly noticeable. Because you cannot simultaneously claim the moral high ground of speaking truth to power and then selectively engage with criticism based on personal convenience. The two things are in tension with each other, and people see that tension. Increasingly, they are naming it. There is a broader lesson here too, one that goes beyond Harry and Meghan specifically and speaks to something about how public image works in the modern media environment. We are living in a moment where audiences are more sophisticated than they have ever been. The old playbook of issuing a denial and expecting it to land has fundamentally changed. People have access to too much information, too many competing perspectives, too many ways to fact-check in real time. They have seen enough PR crises play out to recognize the moves, and when they recognize the moves lose their power. Harry and Meghan's communications team, whoever is advising them, needed to understand that the response to Betrayal was not going to be read in isolation. It was going to be read in the context of every previous response to every previous critical book or article or documentary, and that accumulated context does not help them. What might have worked in 2019 or even 2021 does not work in 2026. The audience has changed, the relationship has changed, and a response that once might have generated sympathy now generates skepticism. What should they have done? This is the question I keep coming back to. And I think the honest answer, the strategically correct answer, was silence, or near silence. A one-line statement through a representative saying they are aware of the book, they dispute several claims, and they will not be dignifying it with further comment. That's it. Nothing more. Because silence in this case would have been powerful. Silence would have denied Tom Bower the oxygen. Silence would have communicated confidence, the confidence of people who are secure enough in their own story, that they do not need to fight every battle. Silence would have been paradoxically the loudest possible statement they could have made. Instead, they chose to engage. And in engaging, they gave the story legs. They gave journalists angles. They gave commentators like me, and like the many, many others covering this, something substantial to analyze and discuss. And in every one of those discussions, the question keeps coming up. The question that Tom Bower's supporters keep asking, if they are so certain he is wrong, why are they not in court? I want to end on something that I think is genuinely important and that sometimes gets lost in these conversations. I do not think Harry and Meghan are villains. I think they are people in an extraordinarily unusual situation, dealing with pressures that most of us will never understand, making decisions under a level of scrutiny that would break most people. I have real sympathy for that. I think Meghan in particular has faced treatment that was unfair in ways that were rooted in prejudice and that deserves to be acknowledged honestly. But sympathy and strategy are different things. You can feel sympathy for someone and also observe that their strategic choices are not working. You can understand why they reacted the way they did and also recognize that the reaction made things worse. You can believe that Tom Bower is not an objective observer and also acknowledge that their response to his book did not help their case. The truth, as I said at the beginning and as I believe more firmly having thought through all of this, is that Harry and Meghan may have just proved Tom Bower's point. Not necessarily the specific factual claims in the book, but the broader point about how they operate, about the gap between their stated values and their actual choices, about the way their instinct to control the narrative sometimes ends up doing the opposite, about the way emotional reactions in a high-stakes media environment almost always backfire. That is the real story here. Not just the book, not just the statement, but the pattern. And until that pattern changes, until they find a way to operate with a level of strategic consistency that matches the moral authority they claim, moments like this will keep happening. The cycle will keep repeating. And each time it does, a few more people in that crucial middle ground will quietly make up their minds. And that is something that no statement, however strongly worded, can undo.